Picture this. Game just started, you cycle archers at the back, and you see this. Oh boy, we're in for a ride. Archie cycle is one of the most uncomfortable matchups for X-Bow, not necessarily because it's a hard counter, but because of constant breach spam type gameplay, which is very challenging to defend. RG cycle decks usually share the same core structure with tiny player-to-player preferences. For the purpose of the video, I will be focusing on the classic variation that includes Evo Royal Giant, Evo Royal Ghost, Fireball, Barbarian Barrel, Fisherman, Hunter, Skeletons, and E-Spirit. For the guide opening, let's start by analyzing support units paired with RG and how X-Bow players should adjust to them. First things first, we do have the Evo Ghost. Evo Ghost is one of the main pressure cards in the deck. Because of its invisibility and splash damage, it can create awkward situations if it reaches your defensive units. Your best counter to the Ghost is Knight, that's why it's essential to always have it in your hand. Another thing to keep in mind is that Ghost is often used to support RG or tank Tesla for it. In those situations, you should prioritize defending RG first with the Tesla, while Knight handles the Ghost separately. Next we have Fisherman. Fisherman is one of the most uncomfortable cards for X-Bow to deal with. It creates pressure as it counters Knight efficiently, allowing Ghost to break through, while also being extremely cheap, allowing RG player to maintain strong cycle control. Your best response is Archers, as paired with cycle cards they deal with Fisherman pretty easily. Last support card that we need to analyze is Hunter.
Hunter, can you call me a good boy? What?
Yeah, okay, not that Hunter. Hunter is RG deck's primary defensive card against X-Bow if RG is out of cycle. If placed correctly, Hunter can completely shut down X-Bow and generate counter push as well. In this matchup, Hunter is important because it becomes the best fireball target for the X-Bow players. Fireballing Hunter accomplishes two things, killing a strong support unit and contributing to the spell cycle race, as most often Hunter is played behind the King's Tower. Now that we all know what we're about to face and how to adjust to each specific card, it's high time to talk about the core principles of the matchup. Unlike against Golem, where you can get away with playing somewhat creative until triple, RG cycle is the complete opposite. This matchup is purely based on discipline and patience. Cycle dominates the matchup. This matchup is primarily about cycle control. X-Bow wins by maintaining favorable spell rotations and forcing RG player to respond efficiently. Most plays exist to control the game and slowly gain cycle advantage, not to create a breakthrough push. Fireball is the win condition. If played perfectly, neither RG nor the X-Bow can break through if both players defend correctly. Because of this matchup becomes a spell cycle race where fireball damage ultimately decides the game. All interactions exist to enable fireball value for yourself and not allow value for your opponent. Log chip accumulates over time. Logs played on offense provide important chip damage that accumulates throughout the game. Even small log damage can determine the final fireball threshold later in the game. Log cycling is therefore a legitimate source of tower damage in this matchup. X-Bow is very situational. X-Bow in this matchup is rarely played per se, and if so, it's almost always played defensively. Correct defensive uses of X-Bow include opponent fireballing your Tesla later in the matchup, or following opponent dropping RG behind King's Tower. Offensive X-Bows are extremely rare and require a much deeper game knowledge such as elixir counting, cycle counting, and overall game sense. Therefore, to keep this guide more new players friendly, I want to specify that offensive X-Bow is always a bad idea in this matchup. Fisherman is uncomfortable. Fisherman is very efficient against X-Bow, as paired with other support units it creates constant pressure. Moreover, it not only pulls your units away from stronger cards that need to break through, i.e. RG or Royal Ghost, but also does not allow you to play X-Bow on offense, due to its being a 3 elixir support unit with HP of a mini-tank. Mere response is the strategy. RG support cards are a lot stronger individually than X-Bow support cards. However, most cancel each other out, therefore many interactions in this matchup follow consistent mirror responses, forcing X-Bow player to play reactively. Royal Ghost should always be answered with Knight, Fisherman with Archers, cycle cards with Log and our own cycle cards, and Hunter most times with the Fireball. Never overcommit on defense. Overspending to fully stop RG thinking that you might get a counter push always lead to losing the game, as RG has the exact same cycle and by the time you're ready with the counter push, our opponent will already be going with his next RG. Maintaining cycle stability is always the priority. Offensive X-Bow is desperation. Unlike Golem matchup, Expo cannot win through a lock if both players play correctly. Offensive Expo usually only occur to either create dual lane pressure or when you need to create pressure for spell value. Otherwise, Expo is primarily used for defensive and cycle purposes. Fireball Geometry. Defensive placements patterns should avoid giving RG players double fireball value. You never want them to hit Tesla and Tower or Archers and Tesla with just one fireball. Good placements are meant to force awkward fireball decisions, which is critical for winning the spell cycle race. Early split lane pressure matters. Since large breakthroughs are unlikely, early chip damage is extremely valuable. You want to apply pressure in single elixir using split archers paired with cycle cards and log. Small amounts of damage often determine who wins the spell cycle race afterwards. Cycle management in single elixir. Bad cycle hands can immediately create problems. If you have a bad hand, RG player can play RG at the bridge or force inefficient Tesla usage, allowing them to create a strong counterpush. Early game, it is essential that you focus on stabilizing your cycle to mirror opponent's cards. Fireball discipline by elixir phase. If your opponent naked fireballs your tower in single elixir, you usually do not fireball back. Elixir efficiency matters much more early game. In later elixir phases, however, the matchup becomes a pure spell cycle race, and you do fireball back every single time. Identify opponent's spell tendencies. Early in the matchup, observe how the opponent uses fireball. The most common tendencies are fireballing the tower hitting one archer or fireballing the Tesla for RG to break through. If they fireball the tower, you can get away with low Tesla, and if they fireball the Tesla, you can get away with low archers. If your opponent fireballs the Tesla, however, you almost always want to play defensive Expo as well, or at the very least, a combination of a log and a spirit every time. This aggressive fireball usage will most times allow you to get away with archers being placed closer to the tower further from the center. Recognizing this allows you to adjust placements and defensive patterns accordingly. Opposite lane matchup. You always want to go opposite lane against RG. Counter-pushing potential of this deck is insane, therefore it is irrational to go the same lane. This is important to potentially force an awkward fireball from RG player. Core idea of the matchup is that Expo rarely wins with a lock. Instead, it wins by maintaining cycle control, avoiding spell value, accumulating chip damage over time, and ultimately winning a spell cycle race. Now that we are familiar with the principles, it is time to move on to the phase-based analysis. Single elixir, stabilization, and early chip damage. Single elixir is where the entire matchup structure is established. You want to be focusing on fixing your cycle, identifying opponent's fireball tendencies, and trying to get as much early chip damage as possible. What you need to remember is that you don't want to go offensive Expo unless something unusual happens. Moreover, you need to focus on defensive stability, making sure that Tesla and Knight always are available. And finally, you need to be applying light pressure with split archers and cycle cards. Important detail is that if your opponent negative fireballs your tower, you do not fireball back. Why? Because elixir stability matters much more in single. This matchup might be decided by single RG shot on tower, therefore, stay disciplined. You will get your damage back in later phases. Biggest danger in single is bad starting hand. If they go RG on the breach first play and you do not have Tesla in cycle, do not panic, defend with Expo. If you take damage, do not immediately try to get it back. Single elixir is dangerous as RG cycle as a deck has one of the most impressive counter-pushing resources. Single elixir is about surviving and shaping the game state, not winning immediately. Early double, spell cycle race begins. This is where the matchup starts transitioning into a spell cycle race. Besides defending every push, your goal here is to start chipping opponent with log, mirroring their fireballs, and avoiding giving them fireball value. Unlike in single, in double you always want to fireball back if opponent fireballs your tower. Moreover, you should continue defending RG pushes that now occur every 20 seconds. And most importantly, you want to go opposite lanes, hoping for some chip damage. Same concept with single elixir, split lane pressure. You need to understand that at this stage, both you and the opponent begin tracking spell cycles very carefully, therefore your defensive patterns become critical. You must avoid letting the opponent to fireball both Tesla and tower, Tesla and archers, or tower and archers at the same time. Therefore, you need to adjust your placements with every defense, as one extra value fireball can decide the game. Late double, maximum discipline. This phase is where most games are won or lost. Both decks cycle extremely fast, therefore your main goal is to preserve defensive discipline. Stick to the spell cycle plan and continue split lane pressure, with the exception that now everything is 2 times faster. Mistakes in this phase are extremely punishing, therefore you need to avoid overspending on defense, rushing with Tesla placements, and most importantly, do not give them fireball value. Defensive X-Bow becomes more relevant from here on, as many times in order to break through, opponents will try to fireball your Tesla, and constant RG pressure should be cancelled by using both of your buildings on defense. This is the stage where smaller, earlier decisions such as early chip damage and fireball discipline decide the outcome. Triple Elixir, pure spell cycle. At a higher level, Triple Elixir becomes almost entirely about spells. By this stage, players are just cancelling each other out with cycle cards, therefore tower damage comes almost entirely from spells. Your main goal is pretty much stick to the same game plan of discipline, defense, and spell cycling. To summarize, single elixir, you want to stabilize cycle and try to get early damage lead. Double elixir is the beginning of spell cycling and maintaining discipline, whereas triple elixir is pure spell cycle finishing. Important note that many people miss is this matchup is rarely decided in triple. Most games come down to early chip, fireball value, and spell parity entering triple. Triple Elixir is usually where the result of earlier grind becomes visible. Because this matchup is so structured, most losses don't come from big mechanical mistakes. They come from micro decisions that break the discipline. So before looking at the gameplay, it is important to identify most common misplays X-Bow players make in this matchup, because even one of them can immediately lose the game. Playing X-Bow on offense. This is probably the most common mistake. In this matchup, offensive X-Bow almost never works if the RG players defend correctly. Typical result of an offensive X-Bow would be Hunter plus Fisherman shutting it down, starting counter push that you won't have Elixir to defend against. Offensive X-Bow should only occur in desperation situations, not as a normal play. Giving fireball value. Another extremely common mistake. Bad placements allow RG player to get high value fireballs, resulting in them breaking through your defenses. Since the matchup is spell cycle race, one extra fireball or one extra RG shot on tower most often lead to losing. Good X-Bow play constantly separates defensive units and tower. Hoping for a counter push. Overcommitting on defense hoping for a counter push always backfires. Overspending leads to poor cycle, weak hand for the next push, and elixir disadvantage. Sometimes taking little damage is a better play. Go in same lane. Many players instinctively go for the same lane hoping to build a counter push, however, RG has much more counter pushing potential. Correct play is usually to build damage on the opposite tower, forcing RG players to split their spell damage. Ignoring log. Some players hold log too long, looking for defensive value, but in this matchup, log chip is very important. Small amounts of log damage accumulate and often determine the final fireball threshold. Passing up safe log chip can lose spell cycle race later. Poor cycle managing in single. Bad early cycle decisions can immediately create problems. For instance, cycling the wrong card early, using Tesla unnecessary, not stabilizing Knight and Tesla rotation. This allows RG players to breach RG into a bad hand of yours, creating early pressure. Responding incorrectly to naked fireball. Another common mistake is fireballing back too early. If the RG player fireballs your tower in single elixir, responding immediately often wastes resources needed for defense. Spell parity becomes critical in double and triple stages. Now that we've covered the most common mistakes, the next step is to see how this concept play out in real games. Because this matchup is so defensive and structured, most winning situations don't come from big offensive plays, but rather, they come from small cycle advantages. Better cycle management, cleaner defensive placements, and consistent chip damage through spells. For the next section, we'll look at the gameplay scenarios and break down the key moments that decide the matchup, how to build your spell advantage, and how to close out the game once you're ahead in the damage race. Pressure opportunities. Early split lane pressure. One of the most reliable ways to start building early damage lead is early split pressure. Typically, you want to split archers in the back, support them with skeletons and e-spirit, and use log to get some chip damage. This forces RG player to spend small responses that can often generate first few hundred damage on the tower. Moreover, this prevents RG player going RG at the bridge in single, which makes single elixir defense manageable. Opponent plays RG in the back. This is one of the few moments when you can apply real pressure. When RG is played at the back, you have time to set up a defensive structure as well as pressure opposite lane to build chip damage and force awkward responses. However, the goal is not to get a lock, but to force them to spend resources before their push forms. Fisherman out of cycle. When Fisherman is not available, the RG player's defense becomes more awkward. This is one of the few situations where X-Bow can become slightly more threatening because Hunter alone can't deal with it and Ghost is inefficient against it due to invisibility. Even here, however, the goal is still usually forcing out Elixir and getting cheap damage rather than committing heavily. When you have damage lead. If you manage to get damage lead, this matchup becomes much simpler. At this point, your priorities should shift to maintaining spell parity, avoiding giving them spell value, and forcing them to be impatient with their RGs, defending each push efficiently. The RG player here becomes the one forced to take risks, which benefits X-Bow player. As you understand by now, pressure in this matchup is very limited. You're rarely trying to break through with X-Bow, and most of the time the damage you get comes from small moments such as split lane pressure, log chip, or forcing inefficient responses from the RG player. Over time, these small advantages start to add up and the matchup slowly shifts in your favor. So, the next important question is, how do you recognize that you're winning? As this matchup turns into a spell cycle race in later elixir stages, identifying when you have an advantage is crucial. Once you understand that, your goal becomes much simpler. Maintain discipline, protect your lead, and close out the game through spell cycling. So, how to recognize that you're winning? Damage lead in the spell race. The clearest indicator that you're winning is tower damage advantage. As the matchup turns into a fireball log cycle race, even a small lead can become decisive. If you're ahead by a few hundred HP, your objective is to maintain spell parity, continue on log chip, and avoid giving fireball value to prevent RG player from catching up. Stable defensive cycle. Another strong sign is when your defensive rotation becomes stable. This usually means that you're able to successfully mirror respond to each individual card of the opponent. For instance, Knight for Ghost, Archers for Fisherman, and Tesla for RG. When your cycle lines up like that every defense, the RG player cannot break through efficiently. This stability allows you to comfortably continue the spell cycle race. Forcing RG player to overcommit. When you're ahead in damage, the RG players often become impatient. This leads to early RG plays, awkward support placements, unnecessary fireballs, and overspending on offense. These situations usually make the matchup even easier for X-Bow player because inefficient pushes are easier to defend. So to summarize this matchup, X-Bow vs RG cycle is not about breaking through with an X-Bow lock. At a high level, both decks defend too efficiently for that to happen consistently. Instead, this matchup becomes a test of discipline and patience, managing your cycle, avoiding fireball value, building small chip damage through logs, and slowly winning the spell cycle race. If you can stay calm and follow the principles, the matchup becomes much more controlled than it might initially seem. If you enjoyed this guide or found it helpful in any way, feel free to like and subscribe. And if there is a specific matchup that you would like to see covered, let me know in the comments. That's all from me, see y'all next time.